computer that you have.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, it's not a question of being a new computer. It's just the Zoom software update. So, welcome everyone. The subject for tonight is the Shulchan Aruch and Jewish law, and we mentioned it briefly in the last session. And Alan Warshaw, you recommended we take a closer look at it, and so we will. And what I think I'm going to do is I actually have some legal material in a um, PowerPoint. So I'm going to sort of begin by sharing that, and I don't think I'm going to go far into it, but maybe we will come back to it. Um, so basically, here's the story, and we talked about this, and maybe in the article. I mean, I briefly looked over the article again. So remember, Judaism is a religion of much more focus on what we are to do rather than what we are to believe. It's actually one of the many reasons I love Judaism is because I can't always control what I believe, but hopefully I can control what I do. But of course, the Judaism is not subtle or brief in what you are supposed to do. I think most of us know that in the Torah alone, in the first 5 books of the Bible alone, there are identified 613 commandments. The good news is only about half of them apply to us because many of them are focused on how you do sacrifice in the temple in Jerusalem. So obviously, none of those apply now. And many of them also apply only in the land of Israel. So they don't apply to us here. But there's still lots of commandments in the Torah. And of course, the rabbis hold with the teaching that when Moses was on Mount Sinai, Moses received 2 revelations. One is the written Torah, and the second is the oral Torah. So the rabbis felt free to create lots of additional laws. And I would say, choosing my words very carefully, that with the destruction of the temple, the rabbis reformed Judaism into a religion based not on animal sacrifice at the temple in Jerusalem, but on study of sacred text, on prayer, and on fulfilling mitzvot. And where did they get the chutzpah to do this? They got the chutzpah to do this with the understanding that these rules were actually given to Moses on Mount Sinai. So, you know, going over the history very quickly, basically, again, with the tradition that Moses got the oral law in 3200 BCE. No, sorry, 1200 BCE, 3200 years ago, 1200 BCE. And for 1400 years, it remained oral. And then in the year 200 of the Common Era, because the Jews were under such harassment, initially from Romans and then from Christians when Rome became Christian, the leading rabbi of the time, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, who was so central to all of this, when he's mentioned in the Talmud, he is simply called rabbi. When you see somebody named rabbi in the Talmud, you don't have to ask rabbi who, because it's Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. He takes what he considered to be the most important parts of the oral law and writes them in a book called the Mishnah. And we know that the Mishnah contains only about 1 in 6 of the material that in the oral law. And again, if there's interest, I can go in deeper in any of this. So you have the Mishnah written in the year 200 Common Era, and then in 2 separate places in the land of Bavel, which was Babylonia, and now controlled by Persia. You have the rabbis sitting around and discussing the Mishnah, and the record of their discussion is called the Babylonian Talmud. And in the Holy Land, you have centers of Jewish study, again with the rabbis sitting around discussing the Mishnah, and the collection of that discussion is called the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud. And it's enormous. and there's legal material sprinkled throughout. And those of us that study Talmud, whether it's Saturday mornings or in other settings, realize that it's a very interesting connection of both legal material and which is called halachic material. As you see on the screen, the word halacha means path or walking, and it refers to Jewish law. But it's also what is called Agadic material, Agadah. And if Agadah sounds like Haggadah, the prayer book we use on Passover, it should, because they're both basically the same word. And it's actually one of the interesting things, even going back to the Torah, there are ancient legal codes, but they are legal codes. I remember reading an article not too long ago which pointed out that the Torah is the only example of a book where law and storytelling are intermixed. So, as you know, in the Torah we have mitzvot, we have commandments, 613, but we also have stories, the sacrifice, the near sacrifice of Isaac, and crossing the sea, and there's lots of storytelling, and it's a mix. And the interesting thing that continues in the Talmud. So you have a mix of legal material and storytelling material. But the stuff is just scattered. And again, those of you who studied Talmud know that it jumps from subject to subject based on free association. I think last Saturday at Temple of Dad Olim Torah study, we were talking about, I can't remember the name of the rabbi, but let's just say Rabbi Yossi. And so it begins with Rabbi Yossi discussing the subject that was being discussed. And then it's clear that they have about 3 or 4 other quotes from Rabbi Yossi, which has nothing to do with the subject that is being discussed, but they're put in there because it's other stuff that Rabbi Yossi said. So if you're brilliant and you know all the material in the Talmud, if someone comes and asks you a legal question, you would know where to go in the Talmud to find it. But there weren't many people that brilliant. And also, I always come back and emphasize this, that before Gutenberg, if you owned a book, it was handwritten. So the copies of the Talmud were all handwritten, and they're very lengthy. And so you didn't have copies of the Talmud in every rabbi's study. So what there was a need for, you see on the screen now, are legal codes. As I say, it's here. It's not what the law is in the Talmud is not well organized or accessible to the average Jew or even the average rabbi. Thus, we need some legal codes. And 2 here deserve special mention. In the article we're going to read, we'll see others. So we have Maimonides, writing in the 12th century, writes a book called the Mishnah Torah, not to be confused with the Mishnah of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, something that took me years to quite keep straight. And basically, he collects what he considers to be the most important legal material, and it's strictly legal material, and it becomes a very important code. And then the next major code, which we're going to take a look at tonight, is Joseph Caro's Shulchan Aruch, which literally means the prepared table, in the 1500s. And again, it's my strong suspicion that this became so prominent because it was the first code written after the invention of the printing press. So literally every town, maybe not every rabbi, but every town could have a copy of the Shulchan Aruch. Yeah, Alan.
What was you can hear me okay?
Yeah, you're fine.
So the timing of this is things get invented for different reasons, some to organize existing stuff or to fill in gaps that other people wouldn't have appreciate. So is the Shulchan Aruch created by this at this time because these codes were not already I mean
No, it'll be interesting to take a look at the article to see if they address that. There were lots of codes, so I would say there are 5 or 6 major codes that are written, and they're written in different formats by different people. As we'll see, the Shulchan Aruch was really written focusing on Jewish law in the Sephardic world, and another rabbi, Moses Isserlis, writes what he calls the Mappa, which means tablecloth. It's a tablecloth for the prepared table, and it's basically a gloss or a series of commentaries on what's different in the Ashkenazi world. So I don't know. Maybe it was felt that a Sephardic code was needed, but I don't know. It's a good question, Erwin.
Yeah, I don't know where I read it, Rabbi, but in Jerusalem, when they went back from exile, at the Beit Midrash, there were students sitting there, and each student had to memorize one part of the Torah. And what
So
I would like to ask you is that this is how the rabbi uh, put it down in writing, that these students told them what they memorized and he wrote it down, or
yeah, so I would say what you're referring to is the oral Torah, not the written Torah, because the
yes,
written
correct.
Torah was written down. So
Yeah,
you had, again, the oral Torah is very long, and in the rabbinic schools, you would have different students, or actually specialists in memory, that
yes,
would memorize various chapters. And I
yes.
think it's why it was chanted. So if I were to say, okay, today, in our academy, we're going to discuss Pesach, and I would turn to you, Erwin, I would say, I'd like you to chant, the fourth Mishnah from chapter 10 of Pesachim. You would stand up and you would say, and so there were geniuses in memory, and different people were tasked to memorize different sections of the oral law. That's how it could survive. Because if it wasn't memorized, the fact that it was oral, it would be lost. And
Yeah,
then
but there was somebody who was writing it down as these people were saying it.
to my knowledge, no, because it was oral law. It was not to be written down. So
No.
you have, it's only after Yehuda Hanasi in the year 200 writes down the Mishnah that, and I may be oversimplifying this, that we start having it written down. So think about the timing. The return from Babylon to Israel in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah are in like 500 BCE, roughly speaking. And the Mishnah doesn't start to be written down until 700 years later.
Yeah.
So the time spans are absolutely fascinating. Les.
I apologize, first of all, for being a little late. Um, could you define code for me? Is this a way of interpreting what's said? Is this a
No,
way?
so a code of law are laws written down in a formal fashion. I mean, you look in a dictionary, but basically, what time do we light Shabbat candles? I can look in the Talmud and go and wade through a discussion on it, or eventually somebody is going to come up and say 18 minutes before sunset. That's what we should do.
So
And
the
that would be
code is
something
how
like,
to interpret the law.
so
What is the
basically
law?
what the code writers were doing is they were saying, I know what the laws are, and I'm going to write down what people should do. And in some of the codes, they would refer to the discussion and the different opinions. But in other codes, like Maimonides' code, Maimonides had a fair amount of chutzpah. He basically didn't feel the need to quote all the rabbis and the arguments. He would basically say, here's what the law is, which is very useful because, if you're a person, you just want to know what time to light Shabbat candles. You don't necessarily want to engage in a long study of the sources and codes. You're a workman, you're a farmer, you're a rancher or whatever. You just need to know what the law is.
Are the different codes dramatically different, or are they sort of basically the same?
Um, I would say, well, actually, they may cover different material, but I would say they are. I would be surprised if they were dramatically different. I haven't done side by side study of codes, but I know, for example, I know that Maimonides basically started with a code called Arba Turim, which means the four columns, by the way it was written, and basically simplified it and just
So the codes aren't all, they're not on the same topic. They're codes, but they could be different topics that they're covering. And then
I would say they were organized differently. So I know Maimonides will have a section on laws of kings and, on laws of Shabbat and so on, which is also very helpful because there is no index to the Talmud. If you want to find laws about Hanukkah in the Talmud, you have to know it's in the tractate Shabbat, and there's no index. But at least the codes that were written in a logical fashion, and we'll take a look at some of those. So they're much more helpful. Henry.
Yeah. Erwin brought up the Beit Din. What was the time frame for that? When did it stop?
Yeah, Erwin did not bring up the Beit Din. I'm going to cancel the.
I thought he mentioned.
Erwin brought up basically academies of study.
Yeah, Bet Midrash.
Right. So I would say these probably begin around the time of the return to the Holy Land from Babylon, but I would be guessing.
Yeah, that's what I read. That's when they returned from Babylon.
That sounds right to me. Les, I don't know if you still have your hand raised or.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I apologize.
Okay. Alan, you have your hand raised.
So I have a question, but I'm gonna, before I say that, my question that we assume this is pre-Ashkenazi and Sephardi, right? So these things.
No.
No, it's not? Okay.
So I would say, see, this is what we call going off on tangents, which I personally love. And I have no problem doing it. So what's the origin of the Ashkenazim and the Sephardim? Here is my understanding. The first diaspora, major diaspora, is the destruction of the first temple. Now, there were Jews that were living in Egypt and so on, but with the destruction of the first temple, 586 BCE, the Jewish leadership is carried off to Babylon. Okay? They are allowed to return 50 years later when Cyrus of Persia conquers Babylon. And the Jews are allowed to return, and we have the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Second temple is built. But there are lots of Jews living in Babylon who are very happy to live in Babylon. Thank you very much. And so they stay there. So we have a major center of Jewish knowledge and Jews living in Babylon for thousands of years. And in Babylon, there was no theological chip on their shoulder to suppress the Jews. Both in Rome, because of the revolts, and Christianity, there's a theological reason to suppress Judaism. So the rabbis in Babylon are treated much better, or the Jews in Babylon are treated much better, which is why the Babylonian Talmud is the authoritative Talmud. It was more carefully put together and wasn't so hurriedly put together. My understanding of the origins of Sephardim and Ashkenazim are the Sephardim are the Jews that stayed in Babylon and ultimately wound up living in Muslim lands. And the Ashkenazim were the Jews that were in the Holy Land, wound up under Roman domination and later Christian hegemony, just to use a fancy word, Christian domination. So I would say that split begins very, very early. And because they're living in different cultures, it's not surprising that they would have different customs and even different laws.
Okay. So these people, though, lived in the Sephardic region of North Africa and the Mediterranean, though, when these books were written, Israel and so forth, right? Well, let me reword it slightly.
It depends. These books, you're covering a period of 700 years. So,
my understanding, maybe
but clearly by 500 Common Era, when the Shulchan Aruch is written, it's after the expulsion from Spain. So you're having Jews that lived in Muslim lands, such as the Spanish. Spanish was Muslim dominated for many years. Were Sephardim. And then to be very technical, Sepharad means Spain, and so technically Sephardic Jews are Jews that actually lived in Spain, but we sort of group those Jews together and call them Mizrahi. The word Mizrach means east. So Jews that were in Greece and so on are Mizrahi. And then the Jews that were the word Ashkenaz means Germany, but basically Jews of Eastern Europe grew up in Christian culture, I believe, were the Ashkenazim.
I still didn't get to my specific point, but let me finish this last comment if I can, which is that I understood that it was the migration of Jews from Italy that moved north and created some distance that allowed the Ashkenazi to develop their own customs and practices that everybody before that, this particular group, which is identified by some things I've read about genealogy, that for all of us Ashkenazi, our DNA is traceable to 4 women who went north of Italy, and formed communities in the Eastern Europe.
No, I don't know anything about that.
That's off the subject. My question then had to do with a level of authority, authenticity. So when you have a code that says 18 minutes, what was the example you?
You light Shabbat candles 18, no sooner and no later than 18 minutes.
That's a code. And my example that I'm trying to understand about customs is the following. And I may be ignorant, but somebody told me that technically the Talmud says that once you've eaten meat, you have to wait 5 hours before you eat dairy.
Right.
Some period.
Okay. So I don't know whether that's in the Talmud or in the codes. I would be surprised if it's not in the Talmud, but I just don't know.
Well, the person that in one discussion told me, well, he was raised with a practice that it's 1 hour. And now the question that, well, some things can be treated as customs, or maybe they're codes. That's the question is
customs. So the interesting question, which I don't know the answer to, remember that's 2. If I get to 10, I'm canceling the class. The discussion in the Talmud may be ambiguous. And I don't know that the Talmud uses hours as a unit of time. Okay. So it may well be that you have the Talmudic discussion, and then the question is, I'm living in Poland, I'm living in Germany, I'm living in Spain. What should I do here? And you ask your rabbi, and it may well be in the codes, and it would be interesting to trace it from the Talmud to the codes to see how it develops. But it's absolutely true that there are different times depending on different groups.
Okay, thank you.
And it wouldn't surprise me if the Talmud says you don't mix meat and milk, and you wait an appropriate amount of time, and then it'll be up to the Jewish lawmakers, the poseks, to decide how much time. And so again, my understanding is that once you eat meat, you have to wait a certain amount of time before you eat dairy, but the reverse is not true. If you've eaten dairy, you can eat meat quickly. But I have heard different times depending on different customs. And clearly the biggest difference is, rice on Passover, just to put it very simply. For the Sephardim, it's not an issue at all. It's kitniot. For the Ashkenazim, it's prohibited. So, my guess is we would see that distinction in the Shulchan Aruch. So first, Erwin and then Jerry.
This is an anecdote for Alan. I lived in a communist country, and I'm sure, my mother and father were Jewish, but they didn't know anything about the Shulchan Aruch. And my mother always told me that I cannot drink milk after we had meat supper. And the answer was because my stomach gonna hurt.
Right.
So, and it was handed down probably through my grandmother or all that, and it was like a tradition. We had tea. We had warm tea at the dinner when we ate meat.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
again, if you went through a period of time, clearly in a communist country you did, where the rabbis were not educating women on laws of kashrut,
Yeah.
then the traditions would survive. Um, Otherwise, women were experts on how to keep a kosher home. They may
Yeah.
not know the reasons. They wouldn't have a Talmud. Chances are they wouldn't have they wouldn't have a Shulchan Aruch.
Yeah.
Chances are there were actually works in Yiddish called Sena Urena. We had another interesting thing to study that were written in Yiddish for Ashkenazi women
Yes. Yeah.
to study and to use. Jerry.
Well, obviously, I think all of us have been raised on some level of boobamonses or stories that our grandmothers would say. But it was actually established that we digest, of course, dairy faster, easier. So in my family, if you had a glass of milk and a cookie when you came home from school at 3 o'clock, then by 6:30 you can have meat for dinner.
Yeah.
So that was the
So
time.
yes. So the question is there biological logic behind Jewish law in these regards? And I
Yes.
would say,
Yes.
okay, I think you've all answered it. I would say for some of the laws there might be, for other laws there might not be. That wouldn't affect our strong opinions on those subjects. But it's just like, going swimming after eating. When I grew up, you know, we assumed that we would be struck dead with cramps if we went swimming after eating. And it's just
Yeah.
not true. And I have no idea whether it is, whether you digest dairy more quickly than meat. That's three things I don't know. Okay, Alan.
Record.
I grew up with this sense about health and pork and
Mhm.
all that, but then the part that I like, which may not be absolute, is that the basis for some of these rules were to avoid assimilation. That the people were living among people with certain behaviors, and the rules were created to keep people from having meals with other people who followed practices, and that was intended.
Like Joseph.
So to nitpick, I would absolutely agree that that is a result of the laws of kashrut.
Okay.
Whether that was a conscious intent, I really don't know.
Okay. I
My,
like.
and my guess is nowhere in the codes or in the text
Yeah.
it says that this is going to keep you from eating with non-Jews, but certainly that is a result.
I never had a chance to eat with non-Jews because I was in a ghetto.
No, I understand that
Yeah.
that
So
works.
you
That works too. But for the majority of Jewish history, Jews were not in ghettos. So the question is, or I would say the observation is, and I absolutely agree with Alan on this, if you can't eat food off of plates that have had non-kosher food, or with utensils that have had non-kosher food, or prepared in pots that have had non-kosher food, chances are you're not going to eat at your friend's house and meet his sister and fall in love and marry. I'd say your non-Jewish friend. And the other story I always love to put it, I think I probably heard this from Dennis Prager, is a traveling salesman, a peddler, comes to town. Of course, he goes to the synagogue because he has to pray 3 times a day in a minyan. People notice there's a stranger in town, and because it's a mitzvah, which is to say commandment, to host strangers, they are actually going to fight over who gets to invite him to dinner. And and it's a necessity because it might well be in that town there's no other place to get kosher food except in homes of Jews. You don't have kosher restaurants in a lot of tiny villages. So he goes to a Jew's house for dinner, meets the unmarried daughter, falls in love, and Jews are marrying Jews. So I do think it's
I,
a
I hope that's what's gonna happen to my grandson in Bozeman, Montana, because he's invited for Shabbos dinner.
I don't know how to break this to you, but there is no kosher restaurant in Bozeman, Montana.
No, I know
And
that.
I know the kosher people in Bozeman, the Chabad rabbi, and those folks have to get their food from Salt Lake City.
Oh, okay. Well, Well, I was just hoping.
Okay, so Cheryl is posting something now.
Erwin, does he, if he has a choice, does he practice? Does he follow kashrut? I mean, by normal practice?
I don't think so, but he goes to the shul that
Right.
Rabbi was
Yes,
involved with
I would say,
for.
to my knowledge, I'm not aware of anyone in that synagogue that keeps kosher, but I haven't been there in a while.
I don't know.
Okay, so let me go to share the screen, and we can start reading this article. We will definitely not finish it today, but that never bugged us. So this is from a website which is wonderful called My Jewish Learning, and it's about the Shulchan Aruch. So, Shulchan Aruch, the 16th century text by Joseph Caro, is the ultimate code of Jewish law. So I'm going to try and give Joanne a break. So is there anyone other than Joanne at the moment who doesn't mind reading a little bit?
I'm just noticing, and before you get the speaker, Rabbi Jill Jacobs is a well-known national Reform rabbi who
Oh, let's see if they have a.
active from a social justice standpoint.
Okay, thank you.
That has nothing to do with the subject we're talking,
yeah,
but
they don't give a
but I know who she is. Yeah.
Okay, so would someone like to read? Henry, please.
Sure. Ask the average Jew where to learn about Jewish law, and you'll probably be sent to the Bible or Talmud. Once there, you may find yourself a bit confused. The Bible includes many laws, but generally offers little explanation of the details of observance. The Talmud, on the other hand, includes an excess of detail, but also incorporates multiple viewpoints, stories, and digressions.
I'm digress. And I'll just point out, if you ask the average Jew, where should I go to learn about Judaism? The average Jew will send you to the Bible, if they are even aware of what's in the Bible. I would say there are very few Jews that I know that understand that the Judaism that we practice today is not the Judaism of the Bible, but the Judaism of the Talmud. So I think Rabbi Jacobs is being optimistic here.
A person wondering, for example, how to light a Hanukkah menorah, what activities are permitted on Shabbat, or what one may eat during Passover, will have to weed through pages of discussion in order to find answers. But those may not be straightforward at all. Given the Talmud's complexity, scholars since the medieval period have attempted to codify Jewish law in an easily accessible format. In the 12th century, Moses Maimonides, the Rambam, composed the Mishnah Torah, a summary of laws relating to all areas of Jewish life. This work, written in simple Hebrew, is meant to be accessible for the average Jew who does not have the skills or motivation to access Talmud.
And I'm going to also interject that most of the Talmud is not written in Hebrew; it's written in Aramaic, and it's written very, very tersely. So with references that assume you know the entire Talmud. For example, in this group, if I said, how many of you recite the Shema? You would at least know what I'm asking, because when I say the word Shema, you know that I'm referring to a prayer which has as its first word the phrase Shema. Well, in the Talmud, they will do that all the time, and obscure references to other places in the Talmud or other places in the Bible, assuming that what they're talking about. For example, there might be just a reference to Elu Devarim, and Elu Devarim means these are the words, or these are the things. And it's a prayer, and it's in the Mishnah, and there's a discussion in the Talmud. But unless you know sort of the code, you won't be familiar with it. So the Talmud is highly inaccessible. It's really meant for rabbis to study. It is not meant for average people to study. And the idea of writing in simple Hebrew is pretty important, because remember that since the for over 2,000 years, people aren't really speaking Hebrew. So if you're Hebrew literate, it's going to be Hebrew as a second language, and it better be simple Hebrew. Okay, well, a century later.
Okay. A century later, Jacob ben Asher produced the Arba'ah Turim, often called the Tur for short, a code that addresses only the practical area of Jewish law. Unlike Maimonides, Jacob ben Asher restricted his discussion to laws relevant to post-temple Jewish life and cited his sources, referring different opinions when necessary.
So again, this is
Referencing
another
different opinions.
this is another important point. And again, I'm not an expert on Mishnah Torah, but from what this article is saying, the Mishnah Torah would have laws about sacrificing animals. And so, that's probably not going to interest the average Jew who's really just wondering, what foods can I eat and not eat on Passover, and how long do I have to wait before eating meat before I can eat dairy? So we have the tour.
The Shulchan Aruch's beginnings.
Hold on a second. Les, yes.
When they say simple Hebrew, how does that differ from just regular Hebrew?
That's a great question. So I will give you an example. In the Bible, I'm going to, have a phrase that you'll know. And it's the V'ahavta. Okay, it's right after the Shema. V'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha b'chol levavcha v'v'chol nafshecha v'v'chol me'odecha. So we have cha and me'odecha. We have compound words. Okay. Actually, the best example of this is the Shehechianu. The Shehechianu is an entire Hebrew sentence. The she in Shehechianu means the one that. The he is a marker of a particular verb form. The chai means life, and anu means to us. Everybody with me on this? So Shehechianu means the one who has given us life. Okay, we know that word. But that's a pretty complex word. I would say that's complex Hebrew. Whereas if you look at prayer book Hebrew, as composed by the rabbis, you have a pretty simple phrase. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. There isn't a complicated word in that phrase. Borei pri hagafen. It's simple Hebrew. And I see it all the time. Ironically, when I'm teaching kids to prepare for their bar and bat mitzvah, the V'ahavta is hard because of all of these complex words and 3 and 4 syllable words, whereas the simple barachas are much easier. So I remember my Hebrew teacher, Ed Zarin of blessed memory, told me that prayer book Hebrew is meant to be simple. The rabbis wanted to make it simple because they knew everyone would be using it. And I remember learning Hebrew, I would say, prayer book Hebrew is simple, ha ha. But it is simple once you've really studied it. So it is absolutely true. I mean, you can spot the difference if you're knowledgeable in Hebrew between simple Hebrew and complex Hebrew.
Would it be something like in English where we have can't instead of cannot? Simple would be cannot and complex would be can't?
That could be one. I would say also, the example that just comes to mind, and don't ask me why, there's a verb form, I think it's pluperfect, but I'm not sure. I will have been studying for 5 years by the time I graduate from Hebrew Union College. So there's a pretty complicated verb form. I will have been studying. I could also say, I studied for 5 years before I graduated Hebrew Union College. It's a much simpler sentence form. That's the example that comes.
Thank you.
Could Shakespearean English?
Well, Shakespearean English and Chaucerian English has a lot of words that are now archaic.
Yeah.
So I would say the interesting thing is prayer book Hebrew clearly isn't archaic to us because we if you're a traditional Jew, you're reciting these prayers 3 times a day. So you know them. You may not know what they mean, which is a whole other interesting thing. I think I related this a year ago. I was in Paris for a wedding. One of Sonia's cousins, very traditional Sephardic family. I went to Friday night services. A beautiful synagogue, 300 people at Friday night services. A very traditional Friday night service. And I asked my, one of Sonia's cousins, who is religious and pretty knowledgeable. I asked him, how many of people here understood what they were praying? And he kind of laughed and he said, probably nobody.
Whoa.
And because it's just now they're native French speakers, they're not speaking Hebrew to each other. So it might be a different answer. I'm sorry, I don't have any of my Israeli buddies on the call here. It might be a different answer in Israel because modern Hebrew was revived from biblical Hebrew. So it's not very different than biblical Hebrew. I think it would sound stilted to the modern Israeli ear, but I think it would be very understandable. It's a very good question, and I'm fascinated with language. I have several books on how Hebrew developed. Erwin,
I would like to ask you if you know or you heard anything. I read that why do Hasidic, specifically Hasidic Jews, try to study and computerize each word in a Torah to get more understanding of the different meaning?
So I don't know what you mean by study and computerized, except to say that there was something called the code, the study of the codes and looking for
yes.
So I would say, generally speaking, the underlying idea is that God revealed the Torah to us, and the Torah is infinitely deep in its meanings. So we see this all the time when we're studying some text, and we realize that we ask ourselves the question, well, why did God say it this way? And then we study it to get more meaning. In fact, I have a great article. I can't decide whether to inflict this on you, but there's a debate on whether or not the day should begin at sunset or sunrise. And it comes from the opening of the Bible where it says it was evening, it was morning, day one or day two. And then fascinatingly, on the 6th day, it says, instead of day 6, it says the day 6.
Because
hold on. Let me finish. So basically, the underlying assumption is there's infinite depth of meaning in the Torah. So why shouldn't I study it computerized and look for patterns that might be impossible to detect, with just my bare eye, but the computer might detect? So I would say, and I don't think it's a very common practice, but I would say, and it's not just Hasidic Jews, I would say, we study Torah to get more wisdom out of it.
But is that kosher?
What would not be kosher about it?
Using the computer to study Torah?
As long as you don't use it on Shabbat, what's the problem?
Okay, okay.
I'll give you even a better example. If a scribe is checking a Torah scroll to make sure it's kosher, because you can't have letters that are scratched out, you can't have 2 letters that touch each other. You have to obviously have the correct language. You can't be a word off, right?
Yeah.
So in the past, the way a scribe would do it would be he would take the Torah scroll and have what is called the tikkun next to the Torah scroll and would check it word by word. And I remember even in my days at Adat Elohim, so now we're talking maybe 30, 40 years ago, they had advanced to a scanner, a portable scanner, and they would go down the rows of the columns of the Torah, and it would be scanned, and they had programs that could recognize letters. Optical character recognition is not very advanced in terms of computer technology. And the program would point out, here's a letter that's scratched out, needs to be fixed. Here's one that's wrong, the word is wrong, and so on. So there's nothing in Judaism that restricts you from using advanced technology. I think that's actually a very important point. And
Yeah, but to your first question, the reason for that is because God didn't separate day and night. That
no.
first.
So all I'm saying is that there's a debate, actually a violent debate. Maybe we'll look at this between two scholars. One scholar gets this opinion from the other scholar and has a dream that Shabbat wrote him a nasty letter telling him to Shabbat, meaning anthropomorphizing Shabbat. He reports that Shabbat appeared to him in a dream, wrote him a letter, and lo and behold, he has the physical letter in his hand, and we can read it. And they're violently arguing about when a day should begin. And of course, as you know, the answer is it begins at sunset. But that was also the subject of a debate. And it depends how carefully you read the text and how you interpret the text. And everything is subject to interpretation. Alan.
So you made a strong statement that there's no restrictions for things like technology and these kind of things. And so what is the rationale that the Haredim used to pretty much keep themselves in the 16th century in a lot of ways?
Well, in a lot of ways, meaning the way they dress, but not they use computers.
They use computers.
And they may restrict cell phones and computers to avoid the temptations that are in the internet and avoid mixing with the non-Jewish world. So the question is, in the world of computer and technology, how do you keep a fence around your community?
With a cord.
With a cord. Yeah, that's on an Eruv on Shabbat. Okay, so let's begin the discussion of Shulchan Aruch, and we will continue next week. So, Henry, you want to begin?
Sure. On the heels of the Torah, the next influential Jewish code of law was the Shulchan Aruch, literally the set table, written by Joseph Caro. Caro was part of a Sephardic family that was expelled from Spain in 1492. After the death of his father, Caro was adopted by his uncle, Isaac Caro, the author of a commentary on the Bible. The Caro family eventually settled in Safed, the area of northern Israel where the mystical circle of Isaac Luria then flourished. Both Isaac and Joseph Caro became part of this community of mystics.
And you can visit his home in Sfat and see where he wrote this text. Alan, you still have your hand up from before?
Sorry.
Okay.
Joseph Caro originally set out to write a commentary on the Arba'ah Turim that would cite sources not mentioned by Jacob ben Asher and would often differ from the Torah's conclusions. This commentary, named the Bet Yosef, reads like a set of footnotes to Jacob ben Asher's more concise statement of law. In the introduction to this work, Caro explains that the expulsion of the Jews from Spain and their subsequent dispersion among Ashkenazic community had caused confusion about the rules of observance. Sephardic Jews often found that their inherited traditions differed from those of the Ashkenazi Jews, into whose communities they had moved with the dismantling of Sephardic communities. It was no longer clear who had authority to decide matters of law. By presenting all known sources on particular issues, Caro hoped to clear up this confusion. Then Bet Yosef eventually became the notes for the Shulchan Aruch, which would become Caro's most famous and influential work. Originally intended as a crutch for those not sufficiently learned to read the Bet Yosef or the halakhic words referenced there, the Shulchan Aruch soon became the most important code of Jewish law. Format of the Shulchan Aruch. Caro divided his work according to the categories introduced by Jacob ben Asher. Like the Arba'ah Turim, the Shulchan Aruch is divided into 4 sections. Ora Hayim, laws relating to prayer, Shabbat and holiday observance, and other rituals of everyday life. Yora Da'ar,
Yoredea.
Yoredea, laws of kashrut, tzedakah, conversion, and other ritual matters. Eben Ha-Etzer, laws relating to women and marriage, and Hosen Mishpat, civil law, including sections on lending money, renting and buying homes, and worker-employer relationships. Within each of these 4 sections, laws on similar subjects are grouped together. Each section is divided into simanim, paragraphs, and those are further divided into seifim. What is it? Seifim?
Yeah, in Sephardic Hebrew, the accent is generally on the last syllable, so the seifim.
Seifim. All right, subsections. A citation of the Shulchan Aruch thus might read, Hosen Mishpat 335-1, meaning section Hosen Mishpat Siman 335 Seif 1.
Right. And I bet it'd be
In
interesting to see. Hold on a second. Let's just, for the fun of it.
Okay.
Yeah. So if I click on this,
Mm-hmm.
do you guys see me going to Safari?
Oh.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So there it is.
That's
And
cool.
let's see.
The English.
Okay. For some reason, it's not translated. I think it is translated somewhere. But anyway, so there is a reference. It's there it is. Okay, okay, that's interesting. Okay, so here it is. So here's just to get a flavor, one who hires a worker to water the field from the river, and the river stops up for half a day. If there isn't any way to stop, or even that his way to interrupt, and the worker knows the way of the river, the loss of the worker, and the employer doesn't give him anything, even though the employer knows the way of the river. But if the worker doesn't know the way of the river, and the employer knows, he gives the worker workman's comp. Okay, that's interesting. So basically what's going on here, talk about detail. So you have a worker who works doing irrigation work. If the worker is sufficiently knowledgeable to understand that there will be dry periods when you don't need a worker because there's no water to work with, if he's knowledgeable and understands that situation, he in effect takes that inherent risk because he understands that's part of the job. On the other hand, if he's just a day laborer and is going to, dig trenches and whatever, and is not particularly knowledgeable about the way of the river, then the employer has to pay him. And now there's other categories and
Rabbi,
so on. Yes.
My question is, a lay person, a landowner, how does he know where to find these laws?
Oh, because he would ask his rabbi, and his rabbi would have a copy of the Shulchan Aruch.
Okay.
And this person who hires workers would be knowledgeable about the laws of hiring workers. And presumably his colleagues or his workers or his bosses would insist that he comply with the law. And so those of us that have studied Talmud would see rules like this. We've studied stuff like this. But yeah, go ahead, Erwin.
I can't imagine that every small shtetl in Hungary or in Russia, the rabbi had this enormous amount of volumes of books.
Stop for a second. The Shulchan Aruch is not an enormous collection of books. It's a pretty simple, I think 3 or 4 volumes, but pretty simple. And because it was created after the printing press, it's not a handwritten book. It's a printed book. So I would say every rabbi of every shtetl would have a copy of the Shulchan Aruch.
Okay.
That would be, and I think that's the significance of the Shulchan Aruch. Les.
Is there any way where in this book of laws what the punishment would be if you don't obey them?
I actually don't know. That's number 5. So let's, but here, okay, so here is actually what you have to do. You have to give them compensation. My guess is that there would be punishment. And even here, I'm just glancing. I've never looked at this. So it says there are those who disagree, and so on. So my guess is that there are. Oh, look at this. Who that hires a teacher for his son and the student is sick? If it isn't a chronic illness, and the same applies if the boy dies, and even if it's regular, the teacher is in from the city and is aware of it, the losses of the teacher. But if it's a regular sickness and the teacher is not aware of it, for example, that he isn't from the city, the loss is on the one who hires him, and he gives him all the owed wages. So they're very, they're very very practical kinds of things. That, to find out, to go back to a Talmud to try and find that, I would say would be impossible. Let me see. Where am I? So I'm gonna, if I shrink this down, nope. Okay, I don't know what happened to the article. I didn't do this control. No, I didn't do it. I think I just need to go back one. And now I've lost you guys. Okay, I think you see the article now.
Yes.
But I do think we're gonna stop because it's about 8 o'clock, and this is actually a good place to stop right after the format. So maybe I'll just read do it slightly smaller. I'll just read here. In general, the Shulchan Aruch presents laws in a straightforward way with virtually no discussion. For example, Kairo's instructions for lighting Hanukkah candle read, how many candles should one light? On the first night, one lights one, and from then on, one adds one each night until there are 8 on the last night. Although the Talmud and earlier texts include other traditions for the appropriate means of lighting Hanukkah candles, Kairo chose to present only what he considered to be the correct procedure in order to avoid confusing his readers. And I can't resist taking a look at this one. So do you see the Shulchan Aruch text here?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there it is. Orach Chaim 671. How many lights should one light? Should he light? And even if there are many household members, and even if the household members are many, they should not rekindle more. Rema, which is a authority, and some say every one of them, of the household members kindles. That's Maimonides. And such is a widespread custom, and they should take care to place their lights in a unique place so that it will be apparent how many lights there are kindling. And he's referencing. Anyway, so it's if you have a bowl filled with oil and you have it with wicks, each wick counts as one light. I bet that was going to be your question, right, Henry?
No, it was going to be what direction?
Yeah, so I don't know. Here it is.
What direction do you
lights in
like
a
the
row,
candles
not in a
from?
circle. Actually, I was curious as to where it's going to be discussed. It's got to be so much above the ground. I remember that discussion from the Talmud. I'm just looking to see if I see an example where it says kindling it from right to left, sunset. So there's a lot of rules here. Oil and wicks that are unfit. So anyway, so that's a little glance into the Shulchan Aruch. We will continue with this article, and we'll also discuss, and I'm pretty sure it's mentioned in this article. I can't remember which one of you was it. Cindy, did you say you bought a Kitzur Shulchan Aruch or someone else? No. Oh, it was Alana. Yeah, sorry, Alana. Yeah, so even the Shulchan Aruch is pretty voluminous, and until Safaria, God bless her, you couldn't find a translation. I remember coming across even, I'm talking about my time in rabbinical school, which is like 25 years ago. It's not ancient history. I remember coming across the statement saying there are no English translations, but there is a sort of a summary not a summary, I'll say a Reader's Digest version of the Shulchan Aruch, which contains those laws that are most applicable for everyday purposes, and that's called a Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. Kitzur means small, and actually, I have a copy in Hebrew. You have one there. We'll discuss it. Alana, sorry, is holding it up. If you can see hers, and I have one in. Actually, I have a couple in English, and I even have one that's over 100 years old, which is strictly in Hebrew.
Do they have Shulchan Aruch for dummies?
Yeah, 101.
That is a great question. That's number 6. I don't know, but I bet
No one's
if
looking.
there is one,
No one's looking for a publisher.
that someone will find it quickly. Les.
It appeared to me that when they were talking about if someone takes care of water and there's going to be dryness, or if someone's taking care of a child who's chronically ill, it kind of is telling me like you're supposed to plan. If you know something, you should plan for the future, knowing that these things could happen. Is it kind of like a practical way that they're doing these things?
Oh yeah. So it's exactly the situation where if you have an appointment with a doctor's office and you don't show up, do you pay the doctor? That's exactly. What this doing here is a tutoring session. So someone has hired me for tutoring, and at the last minute, the person cancels the tutoring session. Should they pay me? So I would say the answer might well be different if they canceled the tutoring session because the child didn't do his homework or wants to watch the Dodgers play on, in the World Series, or the child really is ill. I would say it's a function of the situation. And so that's what the Shulchan Aruch is addressing broadly.
Well, it would be if you knew the child was chronically ill and that
Well,
there was a
that
good
was that
chance.
particular.
Yeah, that's a good chance that maybe you're not going to have to show up. Then you would have to plan. You might tell someone, well, I have this appointment, but if it doesn't happen, then so you can plan for alternatives since you know the situation.
Yeah, so it's very, very down to
That's
earth
practical. Yeah, that's
and very practical.
Yeah.
And again, I would say if you're in a particular business, whether it's, irrigation of fields or tutoring, and you are a serious Jew, and in fact, there's even a phrase you may have heard, a Shulchan Aruch Jew. You will hear people refer to people as Torah Jews and Shulchan Aruch Jews. So if you consider yourself bound by Jewish law, you would want to be familiar with Jewish law as it relates to that particular industry. And then, as we'll see, maybe not in this article, but I refer to it all the time, questions will arise that aren't covered. So you go to your rabbi, and the rabbi may be able to answer you, or the rabbi may say, you know what, I don't know the answer to this question. I'm going to refer the question to a scholar. And the scholar, who would be much more familiar with the discussions in the Talmud, would then look into the Talmud and look into other legal materials and come up with an answer. And that is called responsa literature. I guess probably from the Latin word responsa. In Hebrew, it would be teshuvot, responses to shalot, questions. And I love that literature. I actually have, it's something I'm very proud of. I have a complete collection. It's probably about 15 volumes behind me of all reform responses. And it's sort of obsolete because most of them are now on the CCAR website. So anybody can find them. But there are some old ones and obscure ones that I do have because I'm fascinated by that.
Public website or just the CCAR?
No, I think it's a public website. It's
good.
CCAR. I think, and just look, Google CCAR responsa. I think anybody can look at it. Okay, so I will wish you all a good evening. Blessings on surviving tomorrow.
Yeah.
Alan, thank you for bringing in this subject, for the suggestion.
Yeah, it was a great suggestion.
Yeah, thank you. That's great.
And if nothing else, this should be an example to you that if you have something that you're interested in, rather than me looking through all kinds of articles and finding stuff that I'm interested in, it's far better that I respond to things that you are interested in. But I do want to actually look into some examples. For example, the literature, and I know it from the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, the literature of what does it mean to honor your parents is very interesting. I'm not familiar, and I can check it as to what the Shulchan Aruch says itself, but my guess is it would be very similar, but I'm not sure. But it is very, very interesting.
Is that what we were talking about a little bit in Leviticus this past Saturday?
Well, we were responding to the fact that it says honor your father and your mother,
Yeah,
or even fear your mother and your father. But the question is, what does that mean in practicality?
right.
Does it mean you have to feed them? Does it mean you have to house them? Does it mean you have to love them? Does it mean you have to clothe them? What does it mean to respect your father? And there's all kinds of interesting things where it says, if
Is respect the same as honor?
well, the Torah says kaved, and now the codes are going to say, what does that mean you have to do? So, for example, if your father's used to sitting in a certain chair, you don't sit in that chair. That, I think, is the Midrash according to Archie Bunker.
That's Archie's chair. That's what I was going to say.
There's a great little section, not to give away, the fun stuff, where if you're in an important meeting and your father comes and spits in your face,
Ooh.
you don't take any action or reprimand him at all. So anyway, it's really interesting. So we're gonna, you look.
When do we do that? When are you having that?
I'm sorry, I don't know. After we finish this material, it occurred to me for Monday night, we'll just continue to look into some interesting items in the Shulchan Aruch that I think are interesting to us, because I think many of us wonder about this. What is the requirement upon us that responds to the Torah commandment, honor your father and your mother?
Great question.
And great questions like, suppose you have abusive parents. Does that mean you're not obligated to honor them? If so, what's the difference between honoring and loving? And so it's very interesting. And as you can tell from what we just read, there's a lot of detail in the texts. So it is very interesting stuff if you like this kind of stuff, Alan.
So are some of the points, examples that you even just gave, which would follow traditional Orthodox practices, that they would seem in line, but how do we Reform Jews read that in terms of, is that where the responses sometimes helps?
Yeah. So yes.
Refer to the Shulchan Aruch. They don't just refer to the Bible.
I'm sorry?
Well, the responses probably respond to a range of things like the Talmud and the Torah, but the rules, that the details you're telling us about the Shulchan Aruch, those are going to raise questions of modern Reform Judaism issues.
Oh, yes. And there's a book by it's not Hoffman, Mark, I can't remember, Wachowski, who was the head of the Responsa committee. He just wrote a book on Reform Responsa, which I'm working my way through. And it's very good, because basically what it says is, we Jews don't ignore Jewish law. Let me be very specific. We Reform Jews don't ignore Jewish law. We begin from a place of respecting the tradition. Now the question is, what happens when tradition and our cultural norms conflict?
Yeah.
How do we resolve those issues? Yep. And actually, his book, and that might be a good place to begin study. His book has like 10 different responsum that are selected, responsa that are selected for just those issues. And the interesting things like, should you have an Israeli flag in front of the synagogue? Should you sing the national anthem of Israel? There's lots of very interesting questions. One of my teachers at HUC, who was a character, would say Reform Responsa is like, you may not all know this word. The word is mashgiach. A mashgiach is one who officially certifies the kashrut of a restaurant and food. He would say Reform Responsa are like a mashgiach in a kosher style restaurant, which is a not so subtle way of putting down reform legal issues. But it's not true. I would say, in many cases, I have referred to responsa. They're very important in my world on issues that rabbis face all the time, which have to do with things like, termination of life. When do you pull the plug on a respirator? How much are you obligated to give medications? Jewish law speaks to this, and Reform Jewish law speaks to this. Jerry.
Yeah, I just want to mention another thing that Dennis Prager always talks about, the difference between honoring and loving one's parent.
Yes.
And he uses himself as an example, always honoring his parents, never necessarily loving them.
Yes, and we are not commanded to love our parents, to love our children. I don't think we're even commanded to love our spouses. We're commanded to love God. We're commanded to love the stranger. We're commanded to love our neighbor. It's a very interesting, that could be another whole interesting subject. You can never run out of interesting things.
The man is commanded to fulfill the needs of his wife.
Yes, to provide all kinds of services.
Yeah, just work.
Okay, so good night all, and I will.
You got that, Jerry.
On Wednesday, we're discussing something. Oh, I think it's this issue about should you love God or humanity primarily.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Ooh, all right.
Another really interesting article.
Wednesday, that's the subject?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the subject.
It's not related to the elections.
No, I will try my best.
It might be.
Well, I'm not so sure the election will be resolved by Wednesday evening, but I will do my best not to discuss it.
It's weird. In the 50s and 60s, we had results that night. Now all of a sudden we can't get about computers.
Have a good evening.
Thank you.